to the Thriving Outside the Box podcast. Join me, Dr. Kimberly Grocher, a licensed psychotherapist, executive coach, and yoga and mindfulness meditation teacher, as I shed light on the stories of leaders and entrepreneurs across industries who have not only dared to create their own path in their careers, businesses, and lives, but found a way to do it while thriving mentally, physically, and spiritually. I hope you walk away with the inspiration to do the same. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thriving Outside of the Box with Dr. Kimberly Grocher. I'm so happy that you are listening in and here with us today. And today my guest is Elle McPherson. So I know Elle as a coach, a travel coach. Elle, you do some other types of coaching. So I'm going to let you kind of explain who you are and what you do. So I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thank you. So I live abroad. I live in Argentina. And so some of my work is working with expats and nomads and travelers, sometimes like sabbatical or whatever reason that brought them to travel. And really the work is about the sort of inner journey of travel, because I feel like a lot of folks, when they're either living abroad or traveling, they're seeking on some level. They're seeking for more meaning in their life. They're seeking to heal from things that might have happened in a past life. And so they're already in that mindset. But the idea is kind of like, I call my company Beyond the Itinerary, because it's really like, yes, there's the, where are you going to go, the places you're going to see. But what I'm interested in is more the inner transformation that comes about through that journey. Because often when we're traveling, like my experience living in another country, it really helps to bring to the surface some of what, like the patterns, right? Like a lot of what's going on in our lives are patterning. And when you're out of the old routine, right, you can't really blame it anymore on like your boss or city or your, like it's easier to see what, kind of what's with you no matter where you are. And then to begin to do some of that inner work to see kind of like, what needs to shift within me, as well as there's a lot of, when you get that perspective of being in a different country or seeing different culture, this idea of having a bit more of a lens on like what's mine. And perhaps what is conditioning, what is culture, what are the beliefs and values that perhaps I've been living by that aren't really actually mine or aren't really making me very happy. I mean, like I live in Argentina, which is a different culture around like, let's say work and productivity and hustle culture. So living here, that it's much more obvious to me, the sort of hustle, productivity kind of culture that I don't know if it's really mine. I come from the US. It's hard for me to differentiate myself from that because I lived it for so long. Mm-hmm. But then when I see it here, it's like, oh, it is sort of nice that Sunday is not ever a work day, And I feel that internal tension sometimes between what did I grow up with and what are other ways of being that are equally valid, perhaps easier. Mm-hmm. And all those things really come far more into the light, let's say, when you're moving around between different cultures. So that's a lot of what I work with when it comes to like thriving abroad, really. Like how do I use that journey to know myself better? Mm-hmm. And then I also do sexuality and intimacy coaching. What does that have to do with travel? But for me, there is like the link between like sex and travel is also like a lot of what we learned about sexuality came from our family, from culture, from religion. And so similar, this journey down exploring one's sexuality for me is similar, a lot of deconditioning, a lot of like looking at all the sort of proverbial backpack that we all carry around, which for most people holds a lot of shame, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of feeling not worthy. And kind of poking around in there to look at, what are the ideas around who I'm supposed to be, like my authentic expression, my sexuality, my sense of self-worth that probably came from religion, family, culture, various things. And I think similarly, sometimes being in a different place, either you're out of your own country or your culture where maybe you felt you had to show up a certain way. There can be a lot of freedom from like being in a place where no one knows you, where you have perhaps a sense of more freedom to explore parts of yourself that didn't feel safe to explore back home, or, just being in a different culture that perhaps has a different relationship, let's say, to love, passion, marriage, whatever. can be very freeing to like then look back at your ideas around those topics. So it's very much for me less about like sex per se and more about like who am I as a erotic person and how do I get more in tap with the authentic version of that makes me feel alive, that makes me feel excited to be in this world, that makes me know who I am and what I want, right? Because I work with a lot of people who spent a lot of their lives being who they thought they were supposed to be. At some point, that didn't work for them very much anymore. You can have that conversation with somebody through different angles. But I feel like when I have that conversation about who am I and who do I want through the lens of sex and sexuality, it's almost more like going to the core a lot faster than you're talking about it like just in the sense of career or any other topic. For a lot of people, that question of like, yeah, who am I and what do I want can be kind of scary. And then once you know, you have to go ask for it. So it's some of that. It's like putting words on it. It's communicating. It's having boundaries. It's saying, I want this. I don't want that. And so I really love working with people to help them put a voice to that and get more in touch with like really who they are and what they're looking for in the world.
So I think you are the epitome of living outside the box. So you already know I love everything you do. And like, even just how you explained how, the travel coaching and the sexual and intimacy coaching are tied. They're really connected, right? Like about this sense of like freedom, really discovering who you are, understanding like maybe what you've been taught, understanding maybe what you've adopted from the culture that you grew up in. And what are those pieces or those factors versus what is you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like independent of the context that you're living in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell us a little bit about how you got here. So like what your box was and how you kind of got to this place where you're talking to me today about the type of work you do.
I guess I still feel like this is a little bit of a struggle that I think of myself as my kind of like East Coast smart girl, like save the world kind of want to be successful in like a more traditional career path kind of way. I still feel like tied to that sometimes. Mm-hmm. And then I have what I call more like my inner hippie. They've both always been there. And my life has been a little bit of like trying to navigate between the two of them. Like after university, I did a little like the hippie thing and I did random jobs and I worked moving around a lot within the US. And I always loved to travel. Like from a very early age, I loved to travel, but somehow in my 20s, I thought about doing the Peace Corps or something like that. Mm-hmm. But maybe I just never quite gave myself permission to really do something like that. And then I lived in Colorado for a while. I ended up going back to school on the East Coast for international development because I love travel and I loved being of service. Mm-hmm. So I moved back east eventually for grad school. And while I was so this is really great. So I go to grad school. I think, okay, I'm going to do the second year. I went to an international development program. So the first year was meant to be, in person. The second year was meant to be do like a case study where you're embedded in the organization. And I thought I would be abroad for that. I would finally do that. But then I get there and I realized that I could do an MBA at the same time. So then the other side crept in and was like, no, you can do the MBA. So I did. Did
you do the MBA instead of the international development or both at the same? It was a dual master's program. Okay.
So it meant that second year I had to stay at school to do the additional coursework. So I didn't get to do a broad trip that I thought I would work abroad. So then I thought, okay, well, after I graduate, that's when I'll go get a job abroad. And in my second year of school, my dad ended up being diagnosed with cancer and dying. And I did get an offer to go work abroad. I simply remember getting the offer letter. It was to be in Nicaragua. And I just started to cry. Like in that moment, I think I realized I didn't want to be so far away after my family had just gone through this. So I graduated, took a while to get a job. Eventually, I did get a job in Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. which like hippie self had been like, okay, you're going to go east just for school, and then I never wanted to live in Washington, D.C. It was not the plan. But got a job in D.C. And at that point I was like, I had been looking for a job for a while. So I was like, yes, when can I start? So I moved to D.C. 6 years went by where I was living in D.C. and working for 2 different international nonprofits, doing financial management work, which I did enjoy, mm-hmm. but I really wasn't getting to travel much. Mm-hmm. So I kind of came to this point when I was about in my mid-30s where I wasn't particularly happy in my job. I could sort of see life going like one of two ways. Like a lot of my friends were getting married and moving out of the city and starting families. At the time, I wasn't on that path. And at the other path, I saw like DC is a very work-oriented city. Yeah, I saw a lot of people really doubling down like on their career, and neither really felt like the path for me. I knew there had to be kind of other options, but I didn't really have many examples of what that looked like. And I knew that if I just kept staying in my job where I wasn't particularly happy and trying to figure it out, like I was going to kind of go down with the ship. So I knew I had to do something kind of drastic. Didn't know what it was going to be. So I quit my job. I knew I had to push myself out of the nest or I would just stay comfortable, I know. And I had loved yoga for a long time. I always wanted to do a teacher training program. I never thought like the timing wasn't right. So I left my job on like a Friday and I started this program on a Sunday. It was perfect because it was like, put your cell phone in a safe and it was a residential program at Kripalu for a month. It was like the perfect kind of like leave your job, do something different. And I really didn't know what I was going to do after that. I had someone renting out my house, so that was helping. And thing went to thing after that. And somewhere in all that, like going back to this idea of travel, right? I always had wanted to travel, but I had never really given myself permission to do it. And I bring this up because I think permission is something, there's a lot of coaches and people with little memes that will say like, you don't need permission, just give yourself permission. But I do think that humans are social creatures. Yeah. And sometimes like you need to hear it. You need someone else, even if you don't need it, you do. You need that someone else to say like, yes, go do this thing for yourself. So I'll never forget. I was sort of at home and figuring out for what I was doing. At that point I had sold my apartment. I was kind of like, what am I doing? And my brother said, you've always wanted to do this. Like you should just do it. And somehow that was like the thing I needed to hear, I guess, because like the next day I was booking the tickets. And so I thought I would go for like a month or two to meet, and this was in beginning of 2018, to go to Myanmar. And I thought I was going to go from there. And my initial intention in that trip was that I wanted to take my newly minted yoga certification and do like a trade program and teach yoga somewhere while I was traveling. So I went to Myanmar, and then, I went from there to there, and I ended up spending 6 months traveling through Southeast Asia. And I did end up teaching yoga. I taught at a trade kind of thing at a hotel in Laos, which was amazing. And I thought a lot on that trip about what I wanted to be when I grew up and reflecting a lot back on my previous jobs and what I had enjoyed and what I hadn't. And I realized that a lot of what I had liked in my previous jobs had been the more like mentoring. I had been an operations and finance director, which involved a component of kind of HR work. And I really liked the mentoring piece and being like the unofficial team therapist in a way. So that's when I decided to get into coaching. So when I came back from that trip, like literally like a week later, I signed up for a coaching certification program. I moved home, started doing some consulting, like the similar work that I had done in the past, some financial management work. I started doing that, but as a consultant. Like what I knew really clearly from having done that trip is that I did not want to go back to working full-time in an office. Like that was kind of at that point just a decision that everything else was going to work itself around. I had tasted freedom and I wasn't going back.
It's very hard after you have that freedom. Like you said, like that, like really moving at your own pace and doing what you want to do. It's very hard to go back into an environment where somebody's telling you.
Yes. And like, there have been moments where I think, it would be easier in a way to like have a boss and someone that tells me what to do and all of that. But at the same time, for me, the freedom has far outweighed the rest of it. So I started consulting and blah, blah. There's some more elements to that whole story, but long story short, I moved to be with a boy. That didn't work out. I had to move home again. That was not part of the plan. Because when I had come back from that trip, I was like, okay, I did the trip. Now I just want to like be a normal American adult, and I want to like have this relationship, and I want to build a life in the U.S. Right. That's what I thought I wanted, and then I did that. I moved to South Carolina to give it a shot with this guy, and quickly realized that was not working. So then I was, home again. And somehow in all that, again, going back to permission, I had moved home for the summer. I was like, what am I doing now again? Here I am again at my mom's kitchen table.
Let me ask you real quick, because you have been so many points on the globe at this point, right? So where is home?
So I grew up in New Jersey.
Okay.
But I grew up going to Cape Cod every summer. And when my parents retired, that's when they moved. So at that point, home base was Cape Cod, like my mom's kitchen table, essentially.
Gotcha.
Which isn't like a great place to be in February. It's a summer place. In the middle of the winter, it's like there are not a lot of young people. It's more so now, I think, since the pandemic. But at that point, it was pretty quiet. And so I was like, what am I, okay, now I have this remote job. Like, how am I still here? And I was, again, sort of a permission thing. I was talking to a friend about how I've been researching these kind of remote travel companies. And she was like, that's perfect. You should do it. So I was like, okay. So that fall, I signed up for a program called Unsettled, which was running kind of like adult co-working, co-living programs, which it sounds silly to say this now, perhaps, because I think the landscape of working remotely has changed so much in the last couple of years. But even then, like before the pandemic, it was still not what it is today in terms of just ease and like accessibility. So it felt like an easy entree point. Like you show up with a group of friends, they give you a SIM card, they give you a place to live, they give you a co-working space. And it was just kind of like turnkey, right? Because I was working full time. I didn't really even know where to start in terms of all the research. So I went to Colombia, to Medellin for a month, and it was so fun. I was like, why have I not been doing this my whole life? And I wanted to keep doing that. Buenos Aires wasn't really on my radar as a place I was thinking of ever going, but the same company was doing another trip in Buenos Aires, and it was conducive to like the East Coast work schedule that I was more or less on. So I was like, sure, let's do it again. So I came to Buenos Aires because it was November of 2019. Mm-hmm. And then my plan was after the trip ended that I would stay because I really wanted to go to the south of Argentina, to Patagonia for the holidays. And so I stayed, kind of started to like and enjoy Argentina a lot more. And I did not know it at the time, but I met my now partner. We met once at a party. We got along really well. We clearly had a spark, but I wasn't thinking, I've just met the love of my life. We met once, we didn't see each other again. And then I was headed back. I went to Rio for Carnival of that year, 2020. And then I was headed back to the US to see some family. And I was in a very kind of nomadic moment in that point in my life. So I thought, maybe I'll go to Spain for the summer. Like I was just embarking on this whole newfound nomadic freedom. Mm-hmm. So I come back to the US on March 5th, 2020, to go to a women's travel conference, right? And I also had the idea to start doing this whole travel coaching concept, right? So I land in New York to go to this travel conference on March 5th. Everyone is sort of talking about this. There's this elephant in the room called COVID, but we're all talking about travel. And then the next week, I guess, more or less, is when the pandemic became quite real. And all of those travel plans were over. And it was like a real kick in the face because I had been living this, my life had reached this kind of apex moment. And then all of a sudden it was like, nope. and everyone was hunkering down and going home. And I didn't really have a home literally to go to. It felt like it all kind of just got pulled away really fast. But thankfully when this all happened, I was in Washington, D.C. visiting my brother, and I had lived in D.C. prior. I ended up just staying there. My brother actually went to Virginia to take his kids where they had more nature and space to run around because they didn't have school. And I just stayed at my brother's house in DC for that whole spring, which is actually, it was spring in DC is really lovely. So I had a decent, it was lonely for sure, but I had some friends from when I lived there before. And I look back at it actually with some degree of fondness. And then 2 years went by and I moved around the US and did some other things. That was my sort of domestic nomad phase.
So around that time, you also started your business, right?
Yeah. So when I went to that travel conference, right, idea do this beyond the itinerary kind of travel coaching, right? So the timing actually was terrible because then, nobody was talking about travel. It was, March, it was March, April of that year. So I sort of just backburnered the whole thing, it didn't feel really appropriate to talk about travel at that time in life. And it was also during that time that I had just started doing the certification for Erotic Blueprint Coaching, which is the intimacy coaching I do. So to be honest, when I signed up for that coaching program, I already was a certified coach. I had gone to an event in the fall of that year that was hosted by Jaya, who became my mentor for the program I went through. I went because I had a free ticket. I'm someone who generally is like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll try this thing out. I was not intending to get another coaching certification. No, I already had just gone through something, but something pulled me towards it. It didn't make sense. I didn't know how it's going to fit into everything else I did. I just felt something called me to it. And so that program started in January 2020. So I just sort of like shifted. I was working full time. I was doing the certification program. Like I was quite busy. And I really so I focused on going through that certification program. Mostly it ended up being fully online, and really diving into that work for that year. Which again, it's like, journey of travel sometimes, or just life. It's like, you never know when you open this door, like all the other slippery slope doors that are going to be behind one door, I think back to when I quit my job and I went traveling. I said I only saw two paths. I think what I was really looking for was examples of other ways of being in life. Like I didn't have many examples, and that is what that trip in some ways did give me. Was I met a lot of other travelers or a lot of other people, living life on their own terms, and not in like the route of like family first or career first. There's lots of other ways to live. I just needed to see that, and that really opened my eyes. I think that trip.
I just want to point out that like that kind of representation of these different lifestyle options, these different ways of like being outside the box or creating a life path. Like, I'm so glad you said that, because that's so important, right? Like, even though we don't have the exact map, like you kind of curated a map from like these different experiences, right? And it's something you kind of went looking for, but was also presented to you because of how you went looking.
Yeah, I think it's a mix, right? You have to go look. You don't necessarily know what you're going to find, but you have to look and be open. Because I can remember being like back when I was working in DC, and which feels like ages ago. And I remember a colleague telling me that she was like taking Coursera or courses after work. I remember thinking like, being really like, what would you study? Like you already have a master's degree. What are you doing? And now I'm taking the courses there's like, now I'm aware that there's so much out there. Like I could take courses for the rest of my life. There's so much interesting stuff in the world to learn, but I think I didn't even know about it before, I was like, oh, okay, I got a master's degree, I'm good. And now it's like, no, I could just keep learning forever. There's so much more to learn about the world.
I think that's such a good point, right? I feel like a lot of times that's how it's presented to us. Like, you got the degrees, right? Like, what else do you need? Why are you doing anything else? Or it kind of makes you feel like it almost feels like it's odd to do that, right? Mm-hmm. But like you're saying, like, no, like it doesn't have to stop there, right? And it doesn't have to be about you're doing this course to make, the next career, to do the next, make more money or, buy the bigger house or whatever. It's like, no, like maybe this leads you into something else that you really enjoy doing. Maybe this takes you to a place. Maybe this helps you to meet somebody or meet people that you ordinarily wouldn't have met, right? Like the door opener to keep learning.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Once those doors start opening, it's almost like I've got to be a little more strategic around which doors I go down, because I have to otherwise I'll just like going in circles.
And you have helped me with that, because I have also coached with Elle. So you have helped me with that. Yes. So I want to ask you, what do you feel like internally, what characteristics, qualities about yourself that you cultivated that you feel like really kind of helped you create this path?
Yeah, that's a good question. I brought up the permission thing earlier, because I think for me, as I mentioned, I still sometimes feel like I'm trying to walk this path between the more responsible, straight-laced, like good girl, straight A student that I was, and the side of me that wants to explore things that are maybe a little bit more taboo or make me think, what are people going to think about me if I do this, And I feel like that's a line I'm still walking. And so for a lot of it's permission. I still am working on really giving myself permission to do what I want to do and not worry about what people might think about me. I think that will be a growth pattern for me my whole life. I'm the oldest of three. I don't think I'll ever shake my sense of being like responsible and setting a good example and all those things I was told as a kid. So I think permission is a big one. Like either, how, if you need it from elsewhere, like how to ask for it, and also how to give it to yourself. I think curiosity is a huge one. I think as we start out as kids, like kids are naturally super curious. But then over time, you have enough people tell you like, don't ask that. Don't ask silly questions. Don't be whatever. And we learn to kind of tamp that curiosity down. Or those phrases like curiosity killed the cat. We don't really praise curiosity that much in our culture. So curiosity is that sense of like, okay, I don't know the answer, but what would happen if? Or let me just try. It's curiosity, like being open to what might happen. As opposed to being scared of what might happen. I think that's a huge one. And then, I talk a lot about, especially in intimacy coaching, I talk a lot about like pleasure. Pleasure is almost like a dirty word. So how do you reorient your relationship to pleasure? And I'm not necessarily talking about like sexual pleasure, but just like pleasure, like joy, what lights you up, what's fun in your life? How do you gravitate towards what feels good? And, I teach yoga, and like the language I use a lot. And when I'm cueing and teaching yoga is like, okay, I'm guiding you through a certain asana, but within that, you get to play with like, what would feel good in my body right now? I'm giving you an option, but you don't have to necessarily take that option. You could have your own way of doing it. I always say like, if what would be best for you right now is to child's pose for the rest of the class, like, please do that. Like this is your time for you to explore you. Which I think for some people is like kind of edgy, right? Because we want to like do what everyone else is doing and be the best and da. So I think that exploration of like what would be pleasurable to me, which is not what might be pleasurable to you, is for some people kind of really like a challenge. It breaks a lot of patterns. So whether, one way to practice it is in like a yoga class or whatever you do to focus on you. And then it just in everyday life, right? Like that cup of coffee in the morning, or just the small ways as well. This is something that comes up in my own life, and I see it a lot also in like the kind of traveler community, because there is something of like that grass is always greener concept, like, well, I don't really like the city, so I'm going to go somewhere else, or this job isn't paying enough. I think as a culture, and especially in the sort of younger, like nomadic culture, there's always the idea that somehow it's better somewhere else, which sometimes is true, right? Like sometimes it's not a good situation and you need to get out. And there's also that work of like, what's the pattern of wanting to escape, and what's the pattern of how can I lean into like the pleasurable little bits? And that's kind of the spiritual journey a little bit of where can I find like presence, pleasure in the mundane of life and not always seeking like big experiences.
So permission, curiosity, and pleasure.
Yes.
Those are big. Like you said, those are not things I think that often are presented to us or like shared with us that like, oh, you should cultivate this. Like you should really focus on this, right? But they're huge. And I love this idea of like these other doors, right? Or these other paths or these other journeys that may open up before you if you allow yourself to cultivate these. So I want to touch on before we end, like your wellness and how you stay well in all of this. But I feel like this is one conversation where I feel like that's been inherent in all of this. And it's almost like because you focused on your pleasure, what you gravitated towards, what you wanted to do, even like the kind of like healing modalities you've gone towards, there's been like this inherent sense of like wellness being a part of the journey at every point. So tell us more.
I think especially because even though now I'm more or less based in Buenos Aires, I've lived in like 4 different apartments this year. There's still a lot of like moving in my life. So for me, having like a consistent morning practice, like break it up, I have my water, I sit on my yoga mat, I do satanama, like what I like to do in the morning.
What was that last thing you said? Satanama.
That one's like the one meditation that I've been able to really stick with consistently. I think because there's an element of like using voice. You're using your fingertips, which creates like a sense of presence, and you're alternating between saying it, whispering it, and saying it silently. It really works for me. So that's kind of I really try. I mean, some days I wake up late, I don't do it, but I feel the difference on the days that I don't do it. So having that kind of morning moment where I just get connected to myself, I think that is really important, especially when you have a lot of movement in your life. And then I think the other big thing for me is exercise, like my mental health or like how good I feel about myself is really related to how active I am. So one of the is I used to live in a place where I used to be a lot more outdoorsy, let's say, and I would hike and bike. And now I live in a pretty big city. So I think that has definitely been more of a challenge for me here is how do I like stay connected to my body when it's not as easy. I don't love going to the gym. It's not really my thing. But, here, yoga, I do a lot more dance kind of stuff now, like aesthetic dance sort of things that I didn't necessarily have in other places I've lived. So the more I'm in my body through exercise, the happier I am. Like that is very clear to me. And then like for me too, like a lot of it's just novelty, trying new, like doing different things. So this year I wanted to focus more on my own like creative expression. So I have been taking singing classes this year, which I'm not good, but I really have a good time. I really enjoy them. I'm doing improv. So those things are social, right? Like I enjoy the people and they get me like out from behind because I also think like one of the double-edged swords of working from anywhere is like, it's really easy to get stuck behind your computer. And I know for me, like that doesn't make me very happy. So really seeking out in-person opportunities to like be more expressed and use my voice and meet new people makes a huge difference for me in my overall level of happiness.
Awesome. So anything else you want to share?
I don't know if I need to share this, but if someone's listening to this, they might be like, wait, how did you end up back in Buenos Aires?
Yes. So fill us in on that part.
Okay. Yeah. So now here I am post-pandemic back in Buenos Aires. So just to like wrap up the story part of that, for those more or less 2 years of the pandemic, I was in the US. While I was there, I ended up kind of creating a relationship over the phone with my now partner, who I met that literally one time in January 2020. And when the pandemic ended, I decided I would come back, and we weren't dating really at the time, but the idea was probably we would be if I came back. So that was I felt like a pretty big risk or a pretty big jump. And it brought up a lot of some of the fear I'd had because I had moved one time for someone that didn't work, So I had to kind of work through the fear that this was not the same situation. Anyway, so I came back to Argentina pretty much from the moment I landed. That was it. We were together. And so this year we had a big wedding party here in March of last year, and we're getting married officially this summer in the US. And so it's been a bit of a transition, like for me, between like from that nomad, right, where it was like, I could go anywhere, sense of possibility, to no, like I actually live here now. And that has been its own journey in of itself, and kind of what does it mean to like really be making a home in a place that's not where I'm from, and I'm not a native Spanish speaker. And even just been interesting with some of the wedding planning stuff. I talk a lot about culture and what's mine and what's not. And I think planning 2 weddings across 2 different countries has been interesting, and realizing it's a bit hard for me to disentangle sometimes, like what's culture, what's gender roles in terms of planning things, and what's just me and my partner as individuals. But considering, like all these different kind of cultural pieces into like these big life moments has been an interesting experience as well.
I feel like that's like the current cherry on top of your situation, right? It's like things have come full circle in a lot of different ways. So it's like you've gone from really working on your own independence in a lot of different ways, right? Not just separating from a job, but like moving around the world, like just figuring out your path in a way that resonates with you, and maybe not what you were taught or what was expected of you or what you even kind of expected for yourself, right? And now to be navigating that in a partnership.
That could be a whole other podcast.
Yes. The couples therapist in me is like,
yeah, that has been the theme. How do we make this work? I think we're both, getting married slightly older than we're both 42, right? So I think we both have been independent long enough, which I actually think, having seen a lot of my friends who got married younger, we're both really know who we are at this point in getting married. We know why we want to be together, but we're also both independent people and pretty open about like going forward. How do we live together and also like let each other maintain like parts of ourselves that need to be independent.
Yeah. And I love that you pointed out that you all got married at 42, because I think that's also outside the box. It's not, but it is. You know what I mean? Like, I think there are a lot of messages to us. I don't know about men, but I know for females about when we should have partnered or when is like the ideal time for us, and this like timeline of what this part of our life should look like. And I love that, like you said, you all are coming to this at this time that's right for both of you.
Like we've joked about the fact that if we had met earlier, we were both in different phases of our life. Like I don't know if this would have worked. But I think in some ways the pandemic, like for a lot of people, there was some soul searching. And I think in a way, like the time of most of us talking on the phone during that time, but not being together and going through our own processes so that when that ended and we could be together, we were both ready.
Awesome. So I think we'll end it here. Thank you so much, Elle.
Thank you.